dia. Buenos dias. Bonjour. What else? Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. We'll continue in this second week of our school, advanced school. I hope you all have a good weekend. Could visit some areas nearby. Last week we had the solar, hydrogen, and marine energy. And this week we start this morning and today and tomorrow, the biomass part. Okay, we have already here Professor Suani, Professor Charles, and Professor Eric Larson. And this morning we will start with Professor Suani. Suani Coelho. She's here from the Institute of Energy and the Environment, where a place you already know. You've been there one time at least. And she's the leader of a research group on bioenergy here at the Institute. And she will address this first lecture this morning. Please give a welcome to Professor Suani.
Okay, good morning, bom dia. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you all survived from the first week of the São Paulo school and you had the weekend to take some rest. And today we start the second round, the second week. And these 2 days we will have some lectures on bioenergy. And in this first part, I'm going to try to give you a short overview and introductory session on bioenergy. As Professor José Simões said, I am the head of the research group on bioenergy. We are a research group in the Institute of Energy and Environment, where you have been last week for the photovoltaic visit, seeing the solar panels. Then we are a group. We have now around 20 people, 5 postdoc students, 10 PhD, some master, and some students from abroad, from Oxford University, from Colombia, Mexico. And we are there since 1996, so now more than 20 years working with bioenergy. And we are proud to have the special contribution of Professor Goldenberg, who was here with us in the opening session. If you want to know more about what we do, you can visit our site at the Institute of Energy. You have the address, and then you can have an overview of the project that we have been developing during these 20 years. Okay. In these 2 days, we are very, very proud to receive some of the most important researchers in the area of bioenergy, both from Brazil and from abroad. So we have these 2 days Professor Charles Kinoshita from Hawaii University, Professor Eric Larson from Princeton University, Professor Luis Cortez from Unicamp, Professor José Luis Silveira from Unesp. You have the program. We will be discussing the different aspects of bioenergy during these 2 days. So we will start today with Professor Charles Kinoshita from the University of Hawaii. You have his short CV because it's a very long CV, but you have his short CV here. But I always like to call the attention that he was the coordinator of the only pilot project on sugarcane bagasse gasification that we had in the world, and he remembered that very well. He has been here some 20 years ago with us discussing this project. And Professor Eric Larsson from the famous Princeton University, Princeton University, a senior research on energy system analysis, and also a good friend from also more than 20 years. And thank you very much for both of them for coming, long trip to be here. From Brazil, we will have Professor Cortez, former rector of Unicamp and still working with bioenergy, who will be giving you a general lecture on biofuels in Brazil. And Professor José Luis Silveira from Unesp, which is one of the three universities. As you know, we have in the state of São Paulo 3 state-owned universities: USP, University of São Paulo; Unicamp, University of Campinas; and Unesp, University of the State of São Paulo. These 3 universities have now a special PhD program on bioenergy. It's an international program on bioenergy organized by the 3 universities. And I am very proud to be part of this program, together with Cortez and Silveira and several other colleagues from the 3 universities. So I invite you to know more about that and to visit the site. It's called the PhD program on bioenergy. Okay. So you have had a lot of information about some kinds of renewable energy. I understood you had hydrogen, solar, and this week bioenergy and wind. Is that so? Okay, and marine, yes. What is bioenergy and why bioenergy? Okay, so probably some of you are familiar with that, but we are going to give you some general comments on that. We have in the world, in fact, 2 types of biomass. Unfortunately, we still have in some of our countries the so-called traditional biomass, which is I would say, the old biomass, the biomass we really want to replace, because it's the biomass from deforestation and the biomass mainly wood or dung or charcoal, which is used in a very inefficient way for cooking and heating in some developing countries. But the biomass that we want to discuss it here, and which is the modern biomass, is the one involving modern technologies, which can convert all this biomass in more efficient way to replace fossil fuels. So we can have different types of biomass feedstocks. We can have wet organic waste, some like sewage sludge, animal waste, organic liquid effluents, organic fraction of municipal solid waste. We can have residues from agro-industries, agriculture, and forestry. We can have crops for energy, including food crops such as corn, wheat, sugar. And we can have vegetable oils from palm, rapeseed, and other raw materials. And also non-food crops like perennial lignocellulosic plants and oil-bearing plants. This is the mainly concept presented by IEA, the International Energy Agency, Bioenergy, in the very recent publication, the Bioenergy Technology Roadmap. For those who are interested in going further into bioenergy, I would recommend you this publication. And why bioenergy is considered a renewable energy? As both Charlie and Eric will be presenting to you, because when we grow biomass in a sustainable way, we can have the cycle of carbon emissions. The CO2 is absorbed from the atmosphere, transformed by photosynthesis process into the biomass. This biomass is used to produce energy, and when this energy, for instance, ethanol, is burned in a fuel, as a fuel, the CO2 released closes the loop, and then we have the same CO2 emissions here absorbed when we have the growth of the biomass plantations. So this cycle, closing the CO2 emissions, is the reason why bioenergy is considered a renewable energy. Of course, you are going to see it in details later on. We have extra emissions. That's why the total balance is not zero, because we still use some diesel oil in agricultural operation. We have some fertilizers and diesel oil in transport. So we have some extra emissions from fossil fuels here. And that's why the overall balance is not zero, as, by the way, in any other type of renewable energy, because when you include the whole life cycle, even in solar or wind, you do not have a zero emissions. So, and also, as you are going to see in the lectures presented here by our distinguished guest, you see that, of course, we have to grow this biomass in a sustainable way. Of course, we are not going to make deforestation of native forests to grow biomass, because if we do that, of course, we do not have the closed CO2 emissions. So this is very important when we are dealing with bioenergy, and it's a very large discussion, and this will be also being discussed here. For instance, as Professor Cortez will discuss with you in further details, when we are going to see biomass for aviation, for as stated in this recent publication, Roadmap for Sustainable Aviation Biofuels in Brazil, of course, when we have the conventional fuel for aviation, and then you have fuel derived from petroleum, you have the whole cycle, and you have different emissions in every step until the burning of the fuel during the airplane flight. But when we go for biofuels, we can have a closed loop. So we only have some local emissions, but for the transport and the reforming and so on. But the overall CO2 emissions also are closed, because we have the absorption of the CO2 emissions with the plantations of biomass. So this is why bioenergy is considered a renewable energy. However, if we have a look in the world, we still have a very small share of bioenergy in the world energy matrix. If you compare in the last 40 years, from 1973 until 2015, you can see that the share of biofuels and waste is more or less the same. Of course, it increases because the total energy supply more than doubled during these 40 years. But the share of biofuels and even the share of renewable energy in the world energy matrix is not so big. So we still have a large part of fossil fuels in the world energy matrix. And then, if we can see very recent figures from renewables report, in 2016, we still had almost 80% of fossil fuels in the world energy matrix. And then you see here, we still have like 8% of the traditional biomass, 2% of nuclear energy, and 10% of renewables. And among these renewables, we have wind, solar, biomass for power. We have less than 1% biofuels for transport, hydro, and here renewable energy for heating. Here you can see some historic figures, and you see that the situation is more or less the same. We have, during all these years, the large share of fossil and nuclear energy in the world, and it's still growing, you see, plus almost 2%. Here you can have some special figures for renewable energy and also for biomass. You can see here for transportation, ethanol production in the world more or less stable, a little bit growth during the last years, mainly from US and Brazil. We have biodiesel, also stable, mainly driven by European Union production. And here you see the other types of renewable energy. You see a huge increase on solar PV, on wind energy, but biopower not so much. So we still have to do hard work to increase bioenergy. Here we can see the renewable energy for the final energy consumption by sector. And then you can see that here for heat, we still have the traditional biomass, but we have the modern renewables in this side. In the area of transport, we have here biofuels, electricity, doing some around 3%, not so much. And in power, we have 25% of renewable energy, as we said, driven by solar and wind. If we have a look specifically on electricity, not anymore energy as a total, but electricity, we still see that more than 70% non-renewable, fossil and nuclear. And here, when we have a look on the renewables, we have mainly hydropower, wind, and those 2% from biopower, the biomass origin bioenergy. Of course, here we do not see traditional biomass because this is a modern conversion pathway, electricity. So traditional biomass is only for cooking and heating. Okay. And here we can have some look specifically in biomass. As you can see, if you have a look on the total final energy consumption, biomass is around 13% of the total energy consumption in the world. But here we still have the almost 8% of the traditional biomass. So all of these figures to show that bioenergy is still do not play a very important role, and we should work to increase that. Again, when we have a look on heat and electricity generation and the different types of biomass, for heat we have almost 8% of solid biomass, 18% of municipal solid waste, mainly in the European Union, 4% biogas, a little bit biofuels for heat. Electricity, we have 71% solid biomass. Here is mainly pushed by European Union, which is replacing fossil fuel by wood pellets from forest plantations. We have biogas, mainly from landfills and animal waste. Municipal solid waste, mainly in European Union, and a little bit liquid biofuels. As you can see, electricity is growing from biomass, despite this small percentage in the total matrix, but it's growing. It's growing mainly in European Union, as I said, driven mainly by the need to replace coal in the thermoelectric power plants in the region. As you probably are aware, in the recent past, European Union countries have tried to replace coal thermoelectric production by solar and wind. But recently they realized that this was not so easy because these are two intermittent forms of energy. And coal is an electricity produced in a baseline. And so they decided to go additionally for biomass. And then they are using wood pellets produced mainly locally in the European Union, imported from Canada, Ukraine, and some developing countries. Here you can have a general overview of the biofuel global production. Of course, mainly it's ethanol, followed by biodiesel. The biggest producer is United States, producing ethanol from corn. Then Brazil, producing ethanol from sugarcane. And then you have European Union and the rest of the world with 15% each. The ethanol production and biodiesel production worldwide has been increasing, as I said, driven by mainly US and Brazil. You can see here the ethanol production and biodiesel production, mainly in European Union. As I said, wood pellets is increasing worldwide, mainly to replace coal in European Union countries. You can see it here. Here is the wood pellets in European Union, also United States and Canada. And here you can have some general overview of the international flows of bioenergy. The blue one are ethanol, the orange biodiesel, the green one wood pellets. You see here ethanol produced in Brazil, produced in the US, and also the market inside the European Union. Here you have biodiesel. This one is biodiesel from Argentina, exported to European Union, mainly from soybeans. Here you have biodiesel from Malaysia and Indonesia, which was exported from Malaysia and Indonesia to European Union, mainly from palm oil. And more recently, there is a big discussion on this because there were some problems of deforestation in Malaysia and Indonesia because of palm oil plantations. And this was not driven by biodiesel mainly. It was driven because palm oil has other uses for food. And then this was mainly because of deforestation of native forest to plant palm oil, but mainly for food. But because of that, European Union recently decided not to import any more biodiesel from palm oil. And this has affected not only Malaysia and Indonesia, but other countries producing biodiesel from palm oil, such as Colombia. So this is now a big discussion worldwide about this biodiesel from palm oil. So here I consider this figure very interesting because here we can have a general overview, not only of the traditional biomass. You see here a small fire, so this is traditional biomass, the one we were discussing that we want to replace because it is very inefficient. You see, losses are very, very high compared with the heat that we can use. And on the other side, we can have the different sources of bioenergy. And here the different uses of bioenergy. Here we have the crops. Here we have forest plantations. Here agricultural residues. Here industry residues. And here municipal waste. So we have several different sources from biomass that we can use for bioenergy. Is a very much more efficient. You see, losses here are much lower than here. That's why here we have a more efficient process. On the other side, we can see here that we have not only energy, but we have several different uses for biomass, for food, for animal feeding, for chemicals, for materials, and that is the biggest challenge, as will be discussed here, when we are dealing with bioenergy. We have not only, we have to grow it in a sustainable way, but we have to address all these end uses in a sustainable way. And here you can see the use of traditional biomass, charcoal, firewood, and even dung in some countries. And unfortunately, we still have lots of traditional biomass in use worldwide. You see in red and dark orange, you see several countries still using a lot of traditional biomass, mainly in Africa and in some countries in Asia. And that's why United Nations established recently, in 2015, these so-called Sustainable Development Goals, which are very important goals to be achieved by 2030. But the challenge is very high. You can imagine, the number one is no poverty. Number two is no hunger. So we have a huge challenge to address all these objectives, all these goals. And there are now a huge discussion how renewable energy can contribute to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals worldwide. And in the case of bioenergy, as you see here in the next lectures, we can have different pathways depending on the type of raw material of the biomass that we have, depending on the final energy use. If we want biofuels to transportation, if we want electricity or heat, or if we want materials and products, we can have several different processes and different products. And these are the main subjects that will be discussed here by our colleagues. Just to give you some brief final overview of what's happening in developing countries, I just picked up a few examples of what's happening. In Africa, we have Sudan with a recent ethanol production plant with using Brazilian technology, ethanol from sugarcane, and mainly exporting to European Union, but with 10% to be used domestically. Is there anybody from Sudan? From Africa? Yes. Lots, yes. This I remember. Here you have Uganda, the Kakira sugar industry, which was an industry producing only sugar, and now they have an ethanol plant producing ethanol from molasses, and then together with the biogas plant producing biogas from vinasse, the byproduct of ethanol, as we are going to see later on. We have in Kenya biogas from flower industries. As you probably know, Kenya is a big exporter of flowers to European Union. Beautiful flowers, beautiful roses exported for European Union. And then they have the residues of these flowers, and they are now producing biogas in biodigester from the flower residues and supplying the energy needs of the plant. Another interesting experience still in Africa is this project called Cogen for Africa project, which is a project funded by United Nations, UNEP, where they are using the residues in a more efficient process to produce electricity and to distribute this electricity in rural areas of African countries. The project started with Kenya and Uganda, and the idea is to increase it to other sub-Saharan countries, Tanzania, Sudan, Ethiopia, Malawi, and Swaziland. And the idea is, for instance, in this case of Uganda, to use the residues, in this case sugarcane bagasse, to produce electricity in efficient process, high pressure boilers and more efficient steam turbines. And then the surplus of this electricity used to be supplying households in rural areas. Considering the needs of energy access in these regions, this can be considered a very interesting project. Specifically in the case of Brazil, we can have, as you see with the lecture from Professor Cortez, we have now an ethanol production of 29 billion liters per year. If you consider sales price in pump stations about $1 per liter, we will have some total ethanol sales around 29 billion US dollars per year. And then we would have a very important share compared with Brazilian GDP. Brazilian GDP is like 1.8 billion US dollars in 2017. So 29 billion US dollars per year only in 1 year is very important share compared with Brazilian GDP. So the bioenergy sector in Brazil is a very important sector. And it is very much important, and we are going to discuss this later on, because we have the national determined contributions, the Paris Agreement. All countries have presented their contributions. And in the case of Brazil, we have to reduce our carbon emissions by 37% in 2025 and by 43% in 2030. So the biofuels sector can have an important contribution. More recently, as Professor Cortez will be discussing with you, we have a recent program called RenovaBio to incentivize biofuels producers an efficient production based on carbon footprint, based on the life cycle assessment of the biofuels process. So this is a new program, legislation approved last year, and then it's expected to contribute a lot for biofuels in Brazil. And one of my last slides, it's important to note that we are starting to work with second generation ethanol from residues. This is a pilot plant from Raízen here in the state of São Paulo, where we are producing second generation ethanol from sugarcane bagasse. And in the case of Brazil, the use of biofuels, specifically the case of ethanol, is very much important because, as you probably noticed, we have lots of problems of pollution. You are in São Paulo, we have some difficulties, we have problems of local pollution. And you can imagine, we have a large part of our fleet using pure ethanol. And still, all our gasoline is blended with 27% of ethanol. Any gasoline sold in pump stations, you see all over the country, has 27% of ethanol blended with gasoline. So you can imagine if you did not have this ethanol blend and this ethanol use in the country, we would have problems of pollution, and this would be much worse. And here you have a very recent student published in Nature, very high qualified journal, showing that when we had in the state of São Paulo the reduction of ethanol production, we had an increase of particulate matters in the atmosphere. So you can see here figures of the measurement of particulate matters, and here you have the share of ethanol in Brazil. So you can see a very close relationship between particulate matters in atmosphere and the use of ethanol, which means when we use ethanol, we reduce the emissions of particulate matters and we improve the air quality in our cities. I skip this. Professor Cortez is going to talk to you about the zoning of sugarcane in Brazil. And my last slide, this is a recent initiative of Brazilian government. They call it Biofuture Platform, where several countries were invited to join Brazil to develop biofuels in a sustainable way. And you see here several countries worldwide already joined Brazil in this discussion of biofuels. So you can find probably your own countries in this world map. And so this was the idea of this introduction lecture, just to give you an overview of what is bioenergy and how is bioenergy in the world. We will have, after our coffee break, Professor Charles Kinoshita talking about the advanced technologies on bioenergy. And then after the closing session with Professor Cortez discussing biofuels in Brazil. So have a coffee. How long coffee? Professor Simões can give you some information on that. Later? Okay, so we have some time. We don't break now. We have some time for questions and some discussion. Okay? Please feel free to make questions.
Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. Could you tell us more about the last program that you presented, the BioFuture platform? What is the purpose and
This one?
This one? Yes, exactly.
Okay.
I could not read.
Yes. Well, this was an initiative of the Brazilian government, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, trying to establish a group for dialogue, for a policy dialogue, and then to have different countries, as I mentioned in the world map, discussing biofuels, not only first generation, but also second generation biofuels with academia and the private sector. Why that? Because as we showed you, we still have a small share of biofuels in the world energy matrix. We need to increase it. We need to accelerate this development and to scale up these modern sustainable biofuels. And then we have to address climate change. We have to discuss solutions. And mainly we have also to address the so-called bioeconomy. We are going to talk about that a little bit tomorrow in the first session again. And then also several countries have presented in the Paris Agreement their national determined contribution, which means their goals to reduce carbon emissions by 2030 in the Paris, last Paris climate meeting, the COP. All countries presented their contributions, their goals. So the idea is to achieve and how we could use bioenergy to achieve this goal. And also the last goal, but also probably one of the most important, to see how biofuels can contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. As we saw in the previous slide, we have several Sustainable Development Goals established by United Nations, and we have to try to achieve that. They are very important goals, very challenging, but we have tried to achieve them. Okay?
Good morning. My name is Bruno. I'm from Angola. It was pointed out here that traditional biomass is all for cooking and heating. So, considering the Sustainable Development Goals, which alternative would you give to solve this problem? Because those cooking with the biomass, it can increase the carbon dioxide emission.
Well, you are completely right. The challenge of replacing traditional biomass is very huge. We have this problem in almost all developing countries. We still have this problem also in Brazil, mainly in Amazonia. I can tell you a little bit about Brazilian experience. In the last 40 years, we were able to reduce a lot the use of firewood and traditional biomass in Brazil because we started a very important project based on LPG, liquefied petroleum gas. You probably will say, well, but you are replacing biomass by a fossil fuel. But you have to remember that this biomass is not sustainable. This biomass comes from deforestation. And if you make the CO2 balance, the carbon emissions from deforestation is very high. So the LPG can be seen as a transition fuel. So you move from traditional biomass to LPG, and then you can move from LPG to modern biomass. For instance, cook stoves using ethanol, for instance. Okay? So this experience in Brazil was very successful. We were able to replace a lot the Brazilian use of firewood. I'm going to talk about that tomorrow a little bit more, and I'll show you some statistics. And also some other countries like India is doing the same. One of the figures I showed you here, the use of dung and the charcoal and the firewood in India, is from one colleague from Berkeley University, Professor Kirk Smith, in a recent workshop in India. I was there. I went there to give a presentation on the Brazil experience. And so India is also starting to replace this traditional solid biomass by LPG. So this could be an option. We have some other options, like, for instance, Malawi and some countries in the region are using some cook stoves using ethanol. And then Malawi is an important producer of ethanol. And then they are using, in the region, some cook stoves using ethanol to replace the firewood. In fact, these are some local experience that maybe could be evaluated to be used in other developing countries. But it's still a huge challenge. Even because these statistics showing that around 8% is still traditional biomass, we cannot say they are very specifically because the assessment of this amount of biomass in use is very difficult because it's an informal market. So even the statistics, you cannot say they are very, very much reliable. So this is still a very huge challenge we still have to address worldwide. So I hope I answered you.
Okay, good morning. I'm Victor from University of Malaysia. I have...
Where? Oh, from where?
University of Malaysia.
Malaysia. Oh,
yeah.
Great.
Okay. I have two questions. The first one is about the ethanol production from second generation feedstock. Now, you said that there is currently plant producing ethanol from second generation. So I would like to know what is the, in terms of price per liter, what is the comparison between the first generation, which is far more in commercial quantity now? What is the comparison between the first and the second generation ethanol production? Then secondly, recent research have shown that the challenges in second generation bioethanol can be overcome if there is integration between the first generation and the second generation. So are there efforts towards this, maybe in terms of developing a commercial plant to integrate first and second generation bioethanol production?
Okay. Your questions would take me around 1 hour to answer in details, but I will let both Charles and Eric answer the details during their lectures. They are much more qualified than me to talk about that. But I can tell you about the Brazilian experience. Okay? I'm going to show you some figures tomorrow in our first session tomorrow early morning. But just to answer you, as you know, Brazil has, for the last 40 years, been producing first generation ethanol from sugarcane. So we were able to achieve, as I'm going to show you tomorrow, very low production prices with first generation ethanol. We have started some plants with second generation ethanol. We have lots of colleagues at universities working on that. And we started 2 plants with second generation ethanol in Brazil. One in Alagoas in Northeast, and the second one here in São Paulo, the one from Raízen I show you. The one in Alagoas had strong technical problems. They stopped their second generation production. They were working with sugarcane trash, tops and leaves from the mechanical harvesting of sugarcane, and they had problems. They decided to stop. They are using the trash to producing electricity. They stopped the production of sugarcane ethanol with second generation. The second one here in São Paulo, this one, Raízen, they are still working. They inform us that they had some problems, some technical difficulties in the beginning. They are overcoming it, and they intend even to enlarge this plant. But at least in Brazil, second generation is very much more expensive than first generation. Not because of the technology, the enzymes, and all the process. Our first generation, because we have 40 years of experience, is very low cost. Second generation is very high cost. For us, probably in Europe, I've heard from colleagues from European Union countries, they say that probably second generation there will be more cost competitive because their first generation is not so low cost. Their first generation ethanol has a higher cost. So maybe second generation will be more competitive sooner than in Brazil. But anyhow, we have this plant from Raízen, and they claim they are getting some success, and they plan to enlarge it. But I will give you some figures tomorrow, in the case of Brazilian compared with other countries. And for sure, both Charlie and Eric will go to address this with much more competence than me.
Good morning.
I can hear.
How about the integration part, the possibility of integrating the first and second generation together?
Yes, what they are doing here in São Paulo is that they are doing the first steps until the fermentation, because these are separated process. Even fermentation is different for second and first generation. But then distillation, they use the same sector that they already have. So it's some kind of integration, but you cannot integrate everything. But of course, they are going to talk more about that for you.
Good morning. I'm Jairo from Colombia. What would be the pathway to find an equilibrium between energy crops like palm oil and deforestation? And do you know what is doing Malaysia to deal with this problem? What is doing Malaysia to deal with this problem?
Well, I have not been following too close this problem. I can tell you what I have learned. Palm oil, as several other crops for biomass, has different uses. So you can use it for food, you can use it for fuel. Almost everybody likes the famous Nutella. I personally don't like, but several people like it. Nutella is one of the most well-known products using palm oil. So what was said is that a big deforestation that happened in recent years in these countries were deforestation of native forests to plant palm oil. But some studies from the World Bank show that only part of it was for biodiesel, because palm oil is the raw material for biodiesel. Most of this deforestation was for palm oil, but for food industry. But because of that, in several countries, mainly in the European Union, palm oil finally got a bad view. So several foods, biscuits and other foods, now have a stamp. You see, if you are in European countries, you see they put a stamp saying palm oil free, because the palm oil started having this bad view from this society. I personally think this is not fair, because you cannot generalize. You have countries like Colombia producing palm oil and even biodiesel from palm oil in a sustainable way. So the problem is not the palm oil, the problem is how the palm oil is produced. So this is the main issue. So all this discussion is very much important, but we have to take care for not to generalize. Because I myself think that when you, for instance, the European Union forbid the import of biodiesel from palm oil from anywhere in the world. So Colombia, who has a sustainable palm oil produced without deforestation and in a very sustainable way, they cannot export any more biodiesel from palm oil. But this is Suani's perception. Maybe I am wrong. We never know. So it's a discussion underway. Okay. Complicated.
Thank you. My name is Christina.
From?
And I'm from Moldova, but I'm
From?
studying Moldova.
Mondo.
Yeah, but I'm studying in Sweden. I was wondering, I know that one problem related to biofuels is the depletion of important microelements from the soil. So, for example, after 5 or 10 years, the biomass will not grow that well on that soil, because it was all the important stuff is already depleted. So what do you think is the impact of increasing the share of biomass in 10 or 20 years related to this issue?
Thank you. It's a very important question. Again, as I said in the very beginning, it's very important, these issues related to sustainability. We're going to discuss this tomorrow, but anyhow, it's very important how you use it, how you produce the biomass. And the agricultural phase is very much important. I can tell you about Brazil, it's the experience that we have. We have been growing sugarcane in Brazil since 1500, when Portuguese came here for the first time, and they brought sugarcane to Brazil to produce sugar to export to Portugal. So we have been producing sugarcane in some areas here since 1500. For ethanol, we have been producing it for the last 40 years. So, and we did not have any problems related to the exhaust of soil, as you asked. Why that? In the case of the sugarcane plantations, Professor Cortez, he's from agronomy. He knows that much more than me. Everybody knows more than me. I know a little bit from anything. So you see, I'm always pushing for the others to answer, but anyhow. The sugarcane plantations, you plant sugarcane. At the end of the first year, you cut part of the sugarcane. Sugarcane regrows. But every 5 years, you have to take it out and to leave the soil 1 year before planting again. And during this 1 year, it's planted food crops, beans, peanuts, and corn, and other food crops to make the soil to recuperate. So you have to do a good management, as in any crops. Even when you are planting food, you have to take care of that. So this is why we have been using sugarcane plantations during all these 600, almost 500, more, yes, not 600, 500 years in Northeast, in São Paulo, and now Midwest, and we have been able to manage the soil. And if you are interested, we have also some studies and some papers from colleagues from the agriculture school, ESALC, here in Piracicaba, which have much more detailed information on how they do that.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question.
Okay.
I saw on this graph, for example, when you transport the biofuel from, let's say, Malaysia to Europe, that's pretty much from one side of the world to another. Do you know what is, like, how much CO2 emissions do you have only for transportation of this fuel per liter or per?
Yes, of course, you have to take this into account. I can give you some results from a recent study that we did together with University of Coimbra from Portugal. We did a study seeing how we could deal putting together biodiesel from soybean in Brazil and use in Portugal. So we did a study, and it was even the PhD thesis of one of the students, Erika Castanheira, in Coimbra University. We studied how this could be if we export only the grain from soybean to Portugal, and then in Portugal you extract the oil and produce the biodiesel, or if we export the oil and then you produce the biodiesel locally in Portugal, or if we produce biodiesel in Brazil and we export the biodiesel to Portugal. And of course, what do you think was the best results? You guess? What would be best? To export the grain, to export the oil, or to export the biodiesel to Portugal? The biodiesel. Because when you export the grain or you are export other things and you have the CO2 transportation costs and you are not going to use it. So the best results, as expected, was to export biodiesel directly to be used in Portugal. So, of course, you always have to take into account the CO2 emissions of the transportation. Posso ir? Hã? Ah, tá bom. Então tem. Ah, tá bom.
Hello, good morning. My name is Ulisses. I'm from Pará, Brazil. Uh, the, the question is, the ethanol fuel have a high price in Brazil. For, so, with your experience, do you believe that ethanol fuel was useful? If not, why? If yes, why the other biomass food don't have the same success?
Well, I think the ethanol program in Brazil was a success. Of course, Brazil is a huge country, and then depending on where you are, it may be competitive or not with gasoline. And this is very much impacted, have the impact of the local state taxes. Because in Brazil we have federal taxes and we have local state taxes. For instance, in the state of São Paulo, the state taxes are very low, it's 12%. In other states, we can have the state taxes up to 25%. So depending on the local state taxes, you can have higher price of ethanol or lower price of ethanol. Even because most of ethanol is produced here in Southeast and Center-West. The ethanol production in Northeast has been reduced because now we had most of the sugar cane used for sugar to export. So most of ethanol in Brazil is produced in Southeast, Paraná, São Paulo, Center-West, Goiás, Mato Grosso do Sul. And also when you go to North and Northeast, you have the transportation costs. So in many cases, the local costs of ethanol are not competitive with gasoline because of the transportation costs and because of the local taxes, state taxes. Okay? But if you see as a whole, and if you consider that we have strong problems of pollution in cities like São Paulo and Rio and so on, the use that we have of ethanol in this, as I showed you, is very much important. And also because we reduced a lot the import of petroleum in the country. Probably in the 70s, most of you were not born yet, but in the 70s, Brazil was highly dependent on oil imports. And then when oil prices went up to almost $100 a barrel in the 70s, Brazil would go to bankrupt because we would not afford to pay for the oil imports. So the ethanol program in Brazil started not because of environmental issues. In the 70s, nobody cared about environmental issues. The problem was economics. That's why we started the alcohol program. Later on, we discovered the environmental aspects and even the issues related to sustainability. And even the alcohol production, the sugarcane production became more and more sustainable, reducing water consumption, reducing energy consumption, and so on. So we could have a good final energy balance. Another issue that we are going to discuss tomorrow related to these sustainability issues is the energy balance. In the 70s, when we started the alcohol program, there was a big discussion in the country if we should produce ethanol from sugarcane or from manioc, cassava, which is a very large production in Brazil too, and in other countries, mainly in Africa. And then there were some studies from the University of São Paulo, led by Professor Goldenberg, showing that the energy balance of the ethanol from sugarcane was much better than the ethanol from cassava. And that's why, finally, Brazil was engaging on ethanol production from cassava. But this does not means that this solution can be the same for every country. For instance, there are studies from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, for Tanzania, where they locally suggested the use of ethanol from cassava, because in Tanzania they have a huge production of cassava. They do not use the whole production for food, so they have a surplus of cassava. And so FAO suggested them in the study that they should go for ethanol from cassava. So when you are going to choose a local raw material for producing biofuels, you have to take into account several aspects. Okay.
Well, I have a question, a couple of questions.
Where are you from?
My name is Diana. I'm from Colombia, but
Colombia.
I am studying here in the USP of San Carlos.
Okay.
I was thinking about the energy cane like a solution, because they can plant in desert areas. They don't need a lot of water for grow up. But I was thinking about the technology to process, to make the preparation of the cane, because they have a high content of fiber, so it's so hard cut, and maybe it's better bomb, depends of the genetic of the cane. And my question is, it's like a question in one. What is the state of technology to make ethanol green energy cane? And I don't know, I know that the Alagoas plant, they have this like an objective that use energy cane, but I don't know if they are successful. And I have another question. But
One by one. Yes, energy cane is a good option. There are several colleagues working on that. But when you use energy cane to produce ethanol, you have to go to second generation ethanol, because you are going to use the fiber and not the sugar. So it's second generation ethanol. This is exactly what Gran-Bio tried to do in Alagoas. But until now, they failed. They tried and tried, and they did not success. That's why I mentioned that Gran-Bio now, they stopped the second generation plant in Alagoas, and they are using the bagasse and the trash from the energy cane to produce electricity. Okay? They decided, they quit the second generation. On the other hand, Raizen here in São Paulo, they are not working with energy cane. They are working with bagasse and trash from conventional cane, because they have it in their plants, Costa Pinto Mill. And they are successing. So the fact is that second generation is a promising solution, but we still have some bottlenecks. I have been discussing that with several colleagues working on laboratory scale and on second generation. And we have these challenges before having that working.
do you know another research that they're working in another country or in another place that they're working with energy cane? Because I just hear about
No,
Alagoas.
I have this information only from Brazil, but we have other people. Angola? Oh. But I didn't know that. I knew only about Brazil.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for your brief introduction. And my name is Larissa. I am from the PhD in Bioenergy program. And one question that I have is just like concerning the water, energy, food nexus. So if we are going to increase the share of bioenergy, depending on the raw material, we will probably need more water for irrigation. And then with climate change, then we have more dry in the tropical region. So how do you see this? How do you
I
think?
can answer you with the Brazilian experience. Here, you know, Professor Cortez will talk to you about that more in details, but 80% of the sugarcane in Brazil is produced here in Southeast and Center-West. The sugarcane in these regions are not irrigated. We have the sugarcane rain-fed, and the additional water that we need comes from the vinasse. Vinasse is a byproduct from the ethanol distillation. And the vinasse is produced in very high quantities, like 10:1 compared to ethanol. So we have lots of vinasse produced, and this vinasse is used for fertile irrigation. So the additional water and even fertilizer that we need for the sugarcane growth comes from this vinasse. Of course, we are going to talk about that tomorrow in our first session. You have to take care with the use of vinasse. You cannot use vinasse when the soil is very much rich in potassium content, like for instance in north of Argentina, in Tucumán, where they have a soil very rich in potassium. They cannot use the vinasse for fertile irrigation. But in many other cases, you can use it, but you cannot dispose it very much concentrate in regions because you can have problems with the underground water. In the case of Brazil, we have local legislation and local restriction for the vinasse disposal. So the environmental agencies, they control, I'm going to tell about you tomorrow more about that, they control the disposal of vinasse, the concentration of vinasse to protect the underground water. This is for the agricultural phase. For the industrial phase, we have some water consumption, but in the case of Brazil, we have had a strong reduction on the water consumption in the industrial phase. In the past, we started with 5 cubic meters of water per ton of cane crushed. Now we have 0.5. So we reduced it by 10 times. Okay. We did some local assessment in the last years for a project that we developed here. And we realized that this reduction was a huge reduction on industrial. So we are always learning by doing. So we have to learn how to do it more and more in a sustainable way. People from the back, more questions. Only people here. Don't be ashamed. If I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know.
Hi, Professor. I'm André from Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil. And I have to ask you, you already said that, for instance, that we have this program that to use alcohol, biodiesel, and some other forms of biomass at the most 40 years. And when you are asked by our colleague from Pará that why some regions have a higher price, for instance, in ethanol, that relates with taxes. So when we see, at least in the other lectures, that the price, the cost of the energy is getting lower when you have some similar technologies that were already developed. Why in your country that we have this technology that's well established, at least for the first generation? Why we do have, is only taxes the problem? Why we cannot, why we cannot have, for instance, in Rio Grande do Sul, I never put alcohol in my car because, you know, it's not competitive. It wasn't, never be competitive when you look for gasoline. And okay, we do have the same problem. We have to transport gasoline to Rio Grande do Sul also.
Well, you do have ethanol in your car because you use gasoline and you have 27% of ethanol in your gasoline. You don't know, but you do have, okay? Well, this is the fact. And first generation in Brazil is the lower cost production of ethanol. I'm showing you tomorrow some graphics, some figures, compared it to European Union, for instance, is much lower. That's why, for us, it's so difficult to introduce second generation, because second generation still have a high cost, a much higher than the first generation. Okay? The production costs have been dropping a lot. If you compare, I'm showing tomorrow, the figures in the beginning of the alcohol program, alcohol need a lot of subsidies from the government. Now we don't need it anymore. We still have these problems because Brazil is a huge country. So you have transportation costs, you have the local taxes. So of course, if you see final price in the pump station for ethanol in São Paulo, and if you see in Pará or in Rio Grande do Sul, there is much higher. So because of the transportation, because of the local taxes, because state taxes in Pará and Rio Grande do Sul and the other are not so lower as in São Paulo and Paraná and Goiás, for instance, just to give a few examples. See? But anyhow, as I said, you do have ethanol because you have the blend of ethanol in gasoline replacing lead. In the past, we had the gasoline blended with lead. Now we don't have it anymore, and you have ethanol. So because sugarcane do not grow well in Rio Grande do Sul, sugarcane does not grow well in Pará, of course, if you want to use the local crops, for instance, you have rice, lots of rice in Rio Grande do Sul, use it for power production, the rice husks. When we will have second generation ethanol, we can produce it from rice husks. And for sure, you have locally produced ethanol very low cost in the future. The same in Pará. So, but the problem is that in the moment, we only know how to produce ethanol from first generation. This is what we know. We are working, like Raízen, for second generation, but they claim that we still have some time to make it cost competitive. For second generation, yes. Because when we'll have second generation, then we can produce it from wood, from rice husks, from any kind of lignocellulosic crops, as Charlie and Eric are going to teach you. Let me.
Hello.
You already asked it. Let me go to opportunity. Then I come back to you.
Hello, I'm Daniel from Brasília, Brazil. And near my city in Goianésia, Goiás, there's a sugar factory called Jales Machado, where they produce sugar, but they also burn the fibers from the sugar cane to produce electricity and sell it.
Everywhere, yes.
So there is one source of revenue there for them. That is the carbon credits, because they plant the sugar canes, and the sugar canes absorb the carbon from the air, and they gain carbon credits to sell to other companies, so they can emit more carbon. Do you think this device, this economical device to sell carbon credits, that it's valid in sustainability, terms?
This is exactly what the new program RenovaBio is going to do. This new legislation is starting soon. We will exactly do that. Besides what's already being done, it will be mandatory for all distributors of fossil fuels to buy carbon credits. If they want to commercialize the fossil fuels, they will have to buy carbon credits. So they will buy carbon credits from biofuels producers. So the idea with this RenovaBio is that we will have a more efficient production of biofuels, because more efficient, they can improve their ethanol production. Okay.
Hi, I'm Pedro from Portugal, and I wanted to.
From where?
Portugal.
Portugal.
I wanted to do a question on. Do you have any information on energy output versus CO2 emissions for biomass?
I have some figures I'm showing tomorrow. I can tell you about energy balance and carbon avoided. Okay, sugarcane production has an energy balance of around 8 to 10, which means you produce 80 units of energy per 1 unit of fossil fuel consumption. If you go for corn, for instance, this energy balance is 2. If you go to manioc or cassava, this energy balance is like 2. If you go for wheat, the same. And why that? Because in this process, they don't use the fibers for electricity production, for local consumption. They use for other purposes, so they have to use fossil fuels. So corn ethanol industries in US, and Eric is going to talk about that, use natural gas or sometimes coal in the boilers. In Europe, in Sweden, they use natural gas and coal for sugar beet ethanol. So when you go for the energy balance, this energy balance is much lower, of course, because you have higher fossil fuel consumption. And this reflects in the carbon avoided. If you go for carbon avoided with sugarcane ethanol, you have up to 80% from the EPA evaluations. If you go for carbon avoided with corn or wheat ethanol, you have lower. I don't have the figures now, I'm showing tomorrow. Okay? In the micro. So everybody can hear you.
And for example, if we compare to other fossil fuels like oil or natural gas,
much lower. A lot of carbon emissions avoided, yes.
But they also have a higher energy output, right?
Yes, but the problem is not the energy output. The problem is the CO2 avoided. Because when you are talking about biofuels, you have to talk about energy balance, because the energy balance is related to carbon avoided emissions. You see? Done? So I'm sorry, it's over. I'll be here around during the coffee break, and you can explore also Charlie and Eric today and tomorrow, and Cortez and José Luis Silveira.